From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to the Free Expression podcast from the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please do sign up wherever you do your listening. This week, we're going to take another look at Donald Trump's grand strategy in a time of extraordinary diplomatic and some might say undiplomatic activity the first few weeks of the Trump administration. Everything from Ukraine and Russia, the Middle East, China, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Greenland. Amidst all this activity, can we detect the makings of a strategic project that might define Donald Trump's second term? As he seems to be picking fights with allies over trade and tariffs and over war in Europe, while seeking new partnerships with old adversaries like Russia, is perhaps the outline of a new order emerging? Or is Trump, in fact, simply recognizing that a new order has already been born or is in the process of being born, and he's just simply seeking to seize and shape it? Well, my guest this week has a fascinating take on all this, on Trump grand strategy and foreign policy, and particularly on an interesting historical precedent that may be very relevant. Nadia Schadlow is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and co-chair of the Hamilton Commission on Securing America's National Security Innovation Base. Dr. Schadlow served as U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy in the first Trump term, and in that capacity she led the drafting and the publication of the 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States. In her latest piece in the journal The National Interest, called A World Reordered, she examines the lessons of Richard Nixon's presidency, particularly Richard Nixon's foreign policy in the early 1970s, to see parallels, as she sees them, between Nixon and that period and Donald Trump's second administration today. As she says in the piece, like Richard Nixon, Donald Trump understands that periods of geopolitical reordering offer generational opportunities to update and reconfigure the world system. What can we learn from Nixon's foreign policy? What are the resonances today with Donald Trump? I'm glad to say that Nadia Schadlow joins me now. Nadia, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be here, Gerry.
Nadia, lots I want to get through with you. You've had direct experience of working with Donald Trump on foreign policy and grand strategy. You were a key figure in that first administration. Let's talk, first of all, about this fascinating piece you've just written in the National Interest about Trump's approach to the world, again, what we might call Trump's grand strategy. And in particular, you put it into a really interesting historical context. You compare Trump, or at least the sort of the challenges he faces and the way he approaches those challenges, with Richard Nixon, President Nixon, back in 1969 and beyond. Tell us first of all what you think that parallel is and why you think it has some resonance today.
Sure. Well, I was doing some reading in preparation for a talk that I was going to give, and I like to pull books down from my shelf to prepare for things like that. And I pulled one of Nixon's books that he wrote after the presidency called Real Peace. And I just started to read, and it just became so apparent to me that the way he thought about the world and geopolitics and balance of power just had some real parallels to the situation that we're facing today. So then I went back to his actual original report to Congress in 1970, which at the time they had not yet instituted a national security strategy like the ones that we have today. When Nixon was president, Congress had not yet mandated that you have to produce these national security strategies. So he presented a report on foreign policy to the Congress, and I urge anyone to read it. It's really good, really well written. And that 1970 report, Nixon began by saying, look, we're facing a world that's really different from the post-World War II world. The United States is no longer the dominant power. Allies and partners are becoming stronger. We still want to lead in the world, but we're not dominant, and we need to use our leadership to ensure that there's stability in the world. And he had a formula, what he called the durable peace, 3 elements to that formula. And I'll mention those 3 elements, and I think the listeners here will immediately see how relevant they are. One was peace through strength. which surprised me because I thought that had been Reagan's phrase.
Yeah, we always associate that with Reagan, but it's interesting. Right. Did Nixon actually use that very term?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, he used it. I mean, not even in biographers. Like, it was his term. Yeah. Shared responsibility, which he used as well, and a belief in the importance of negotiations, that you need to be willing to speak to anyone, your enemies, adversaries, and that was an important tool. So those three elements, anyone watching what's happening today and thinking about Trump's foreign policy, I think the parallels are they're pretty stark, right?
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. Those three are all there. And we can get into the detail. I particularly want to get into the detail of the way in which Trump is applying, if you like, if he is applying those principles. You make the point very well, you just said it there, and you make it in the piece, that it is a different world. And I think maybe, that's one of the things that's important to understand. I mean, we're all kind of trying to digest the new Trump approach, right? Even though we've seen 4 years of Trump before, it has been a pretty extraordinary first 6 weeks with, everything from annexing Canada and Greenland to taking over Gaza and apparently seeming to tilt strongly towards Russia. But I think what's helpful about your framework is that it is important to understand, again, today in 2025, just as it was in 69, 70, it is a different world. How would you describe that? What is new about today? What has Trump recognized that is a fundamental reordering of the world from, say, what's gone on over, let's say the post-Cold War period?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, at the end of the piece, I'm not sure if I'm right in the sense that I think one thing I'm struggling with is Nixon very firmly believed.
It's more important to be interesting than right, Nadia. I think we all learn that.
But Nixon firmly believed in the importance of a balance of power and in keeping a balance of power. This might have been Kissinger's words, but talking about when he wrote about Nixon, he wanted to prevent an adversary from accumulating marginal gains, which over time would overthrow the balance of power. So Nixon really believed in the importance of stability and that American leadership, and we could talk about the form that leadership will take, that American leadership was central for that stability. Nixon had a quote when he was interviewed in Time magazine later that fundamental to the balance of power was ensuring that the U.S., the Soviet Union, China, Japan, and Europe all balance each other, that they're strong and healthy, but they balance each other. So I am not 100% sure, where President Trump is on balance of power. I think he fundamentally does understand that if American power is diminished, that is not going to be good for the United States over the medium to long term. So I think he appreciates that. I think he understands that. Nixon strongly believed that the vacuum of power would be filled if the United States was not leading on the world stage. I think Trump doesn't want to be in a position where he is beholden to or at the behest of other countries. So that, I think, is what sort of I'm grappling with. And I don't know, Gerry, you write and think about these issues. What do you think?
Well, in fact, one of the things I was going to say to you on this question of the balance of power is there's been a lot of, interesting, I guess it's really only speculation at this point. One of the problems I think we always have with Trump is that his statements and his behavior on not just on foreign policy, but on a range of things, are not necessarily kind of take a very tightly consistent form. He says one thing one day and then something else the next. And I think there's also a sense that Trump operates in a kind of an instinctual way. I think, and again, I don't mean this in any way to be demeaning about Trump. Trump has extraordinary political instincts, whereas Nixon wrote and thought deeply about these issues, right the way through his time in Congress and then in the vice presidency. And then when he was contemplating running for the presidency, I'm not sure that Trump thinks in those terms. But one of the things that's been talked about in this context of the balance of power that you talk about is this idea that I've heard in several quarters that Trump sort of believes in a kind of great power world. Some people say this is a geographic-based great power world where he thinks in terms of spheres of influence. America, United States sphere of influence is sort of the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. Somehow, Russia dominates kind of Eurasia, or at least Europe, and China sort of maybe dominates East Asia, the Pacific, or at least the Western Pacific. Again, I'm sure that's too simplistic. But do you think, from what you've seen so far, and again, I absolutely appreciate that we're speculating here, do you think there's something to that he does that rather in thinking in terms, the way that so many post-Cold War presidents have, as America as the leader of a kind of global, what we talk about, a liberal order, leader of the free world, as we used to call it, that perhaps he thinks in rather kind of narrower national interest, as I say, kind of in a great power framework? Do you see evidence for that, or do you think that's kind of over-interpreting what he's doing?
No, I think he begins from the perspective of the nation state and sovereignty and what's good for the United States. So I think the arguments that we're having overall in these discussions is the degree to which that then, so I think everyone can agree on that. But then how do developments elsewhere in the world impact the United States? So I think we're having arguments about that. I think the sphere of influence point that you made is an interesting one. And this sounds sort of too theoretical and policy wonky, but I think a fundamental difference with thinking about balance of power and a sphere of influence is that we can't really control whether or not China or Russia or Iran, for that matter, are going to stay in their sphere, right? So that's kind of the argument that we're having. There are plenty of quotes about China needing to lead the reform of the global governance system, right? I've collected sort of quotes on this from CCP leaders, from Xi. China must make the international order more reasonable and just to protect the common interests of China. So I think the problem with the sphere of influence approach is that how are you going to be sure that a country is going to stay in their sphere and not sort of encroach on your sphere of influence, right? So I think a balance of power concept is one that I think Nixon favored it, I would say, for that reason. But, obviously I'm not speaking for him.
Talk about some of these Nixonian, because again, I am fascinated by this parallel, this Nixonian parallel. And there are things that we can already see people are talking about even early on in this second Trump term, which do have kind of sort of Nixonian characteristics. And one of them is this idea. So Nixon, of course, very, very famously went to China, literally and figuratively, Kissinger first, and exploited the growing differences that had emerged between the Soviet Union and China, had that big opening to the People's Republic, and that was considered in the sort of chessboard diplomacy of the Cold War, enormously important, actually arguably contributed in the long run to the United States being able to win the Cold War by prizing China away from Russia. There's this argument, again, that I've heard from smart people who know Trump and have been following this, that maybe what we see with Trump and Russia right now, and in particular his pretty remarkable kind of tilt to Russia, his strong criticism of Ukraine and his apparent sort of favoring of Russia over Ukraine in that war, as far as we can tell. Maybe I'm going a little too far. But that one of the arguments I've heard for that is that we know about the Russia-China partnership without limits, announced between Putin and Xi just before the invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, that maybe part of this here is a kind of almost a sort of a reverse Nixon, that it's kind of Trump going to Moscow, as it were, trying to prize Moscow away from that alliance with China. Again, you studied Nixon very, very closely, and you've worked with Trump. Do you see a possibility of that there's a big strategic objective here, which is to break up that alliance, that partnership between Russia and China, which does, after all, potentially pose such a significant threat to U.S. global interests?
I don't see it in a clear way in that way. I think there are some fundamental differences, and the point that you made, Gerry, is the right one. Nixon was exploiting a growing enmity, a growing argument between the Soviet Union and China at the time. There was a lot of name calling, and some of it sort of amusing. Khrushchev called Mao an ultra-leftist, ultra-dogmatist, revisionist, a Buddha who gets theory out of his nose. So there was a lot of fun name calling. So there was an opportunity to exploit this growing enmity between these two powers. I don't see that parallel today. Second, there was an ideological component to Nixon's approach, too. I mean, Nixon was really concerned about the threat of communism and saw communism and global communism around the world as a threat to the United States, and breaking that movement up. He talked about the pluralism at the time. Breaking it up was important because it was, again, diminished that movement and de facto strengthened the U.S. I don't see what we get. So I think we gained. We did weaken that global communist movement at the time. I don't see what we get from sort of an alignment with Russia today. Yes, tactically, an end to the war. But the broader kind of geopolitical alignment, the gains we have, even if we were more closely aligned with Russia, and even if Putin and Trump managed some sort of rapprochement that somehow works out, how does that change the fundamental problems we're facing and challenges vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, all good questions.
So I think, right, like even a super close relationship with Russia does not change any of the dynamics about what the United States is facing vis-a-vis China.
All good points, and for what it's worth, and it's not worth as much as your view, but I agree with you. I don't really see pulling Russia away from China as clear. So if that's not the case, so let me try another idea on you, which I've also heard mentioned, which is that, again, one of Trump's bigger priorities is to deal with Iran, or maybe to help Israel deal with Iran, to deal with the kind of strategic threat that Iran poses in the Middle East. And of course, again, Iran is an ally of Russia. Russia's been very close with Iran for some time, and that maybe part of what he's doing here as he seeks this very close rapprochement with Russia is maybe again prizing Russia away from Iran to either list Russia in the effort to prevent Iran from getting nuclear capability, or maybe even to sort of buy Russia off as Israel, with US backing, moves to a more aggressive posture towards Iran, including possibly even actually like military action to take out their nuclear facilities. Do you see anything in that?
I think that that's more plausible in the sense that that's where, to answer the question of what would we get out of Russia with the rapprochement, would be this idea that then Trump could turn to Putin and say, hey, stop supporting Iran, stay out of the Middle East, stop causing trouble for Israel. These are just theories, but you can see more of what the leverage and the linkage, I think, in that domain. But I'm not so sure, again, in other domains. Energy, then does Russia become a competitor to us in the energy domain? So I think the Middle East approach might be the most plausible, but I think it would be really hard to trust Putin and to think that he would abide by any sort of agreement in that domain.
Again, I'm having difficulty disagreeing with you, but I'm also having difficulty understanding then what is behind this rapprochement with Russia. And again, you mentioned this right at the start. Other than just kind of a desire to bring about an end to that war, which may be a virtue in itself, although obviously there are a lot of people, and I don't know where you stand on this, concerned about the terms on which you bring an end to the Russia-Ukraine war. If Russia is anyway seen to be rewarded for its, I think we all agree, to be an act of aggression against Ukraine, where does that leave US interests or our broader interests in the longer term? But again, I'm sort of just hypothesizing here. But what do you see other than just some sort of desire to bring an end to that war, or just because he has a personal thing for Putin and a personal hostility towards Zelensky? What do you see in this pretty dramatic shift in US posture towards Russia that Trump seems to be doing?
I think part of it, which I'm not going to get into because it's long and complicated, but I think it's very hard to separate Trump's approach toward Russia and Ukraine from the early years of his first administration. So from the domestic elements of all of that.
Russia gates and all of that.
I don't think you can completely separate the two. Today, I think partly it's that everyone tends to react immediately to what Trump says or does immediately without sort of waiting to actually see effects that have taken place. I think we will see a negotiated settlement that will probably be along the lines that people have thought for a long time it would be, along the lines of where borders were probably at the beginning, at the outset of the war. I think we will see a mineral deal. I think just recently, basically, President Zelensky came back and said, we want a mineral deal. So I think we're going to see some sort of negotiated settlement. I think partly also perhaps Trump has been angry at the Europeans for a long time for a range of reasons. I think partly his approach toward Putin is linked to that as well, with a sense of him being fed up that the Europeans have spent so much time, not fulfilling their share of the burden sharing argument. Although, to be fair, Europe has come along. Many of the European countries have anyway, not all, many.
And again, I don't want to press you on this because this is not particularly in your field of interest, but I think that, there is a view which I also find a little bit persuasive, that the whole kind of Trump-Russia thing, I think you're absolutely right about the experience of his first year or two of his first term. But the sort of broader, especially of the sort of MAGA right, the Republican, if we can call it that, the strongly Trump MAGA crowd in the Republican Party, it's almost cultural with them. And, there's so much hostility to what they see as the kind of liberal, progressive, cultural hegemony, whether in this country or obviously in most of Western Europe, is so inimical to them. And they ascribe so many of the problems of the West, and our decline and all of that, and, civilizational decline to all of that, that actually, it's my enemy's enemy, as it were. If Russia's the enemy of that, then they're probably on the right side. We'll take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Nadia Schadlow on the lessons of Richard Nixon's foreign policy for Donald Trump. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm with Nadia Schadlow, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, former Deputy National Security Advisor to Donald Trump in his first term. We're talking about perhaps some of the historical lessons for Donald Trump in foreign policy that will shape his second term. Moving on, Nadia, but let me ask you about another really interesting parallel, and again, you refer to this in your piece, between Trump and Nixon, which I think is a really obvious but sometimes overlooked one, is what you talked about, and you say, that the importance of negotiations, as you just said. I mean, that is something we saw in Trump's first term, right? The extraordinary kind of unexpected outreach to the most improbable of interlocutors. We saw it most dramatically, perhaps, with Kim Jong-un, North Korea. I mean, Trump came into office in 2017 threatening to press his nuclear button because it was bigger than Kim Jong-un's and visit fire and fury on North Korea. And within about a year and a half, he was saying that the two had fallen a little bit in love. And, again, I don't want to overdo the Nixon comparison, but, Nixon going to China has literally sort of entered the kind of geopolitical lexicon as somebody doing something utterly improbable and being able to achieve something because it was so improbable, as it were. North Korea may continue to pose its own problems, but do you see more of that in Trump's second term? And in particular, I wonder about China. The whole national security establishment, it seems to me, in the United States over the last 10 years has kind of fundamentally reoriented towards regarding China as the great strategic challenge, of the moment, possibly of American history, and everything being built up to sort of deal with that. But is there a chance that Trump maybe, in a sort of almost, again, Gordian knot style way, sees an opportunity to pull off some sort of a détente or some sort of a actually improved relationship or rapprochement with China?
I would say probably yes. Absolutely. I'm not sure it's going to be successful, but I think he definitely is looking at opportunities. He loves linkage, right? That's his favorite thing. Negotiations, getting the deal, and linkage. Tariffs, right? And look how it's worked so far. I mean, it's working in many ways. In Panama, we've seen a complete shift now in key dynamics in the Panama Canal. Threatening tariffs on Canada have led Ottawa to add thousands of people to shore up the border. Mexico to deploy its National Guard to stop fentanyl. Europeans now, in negotiating with Russia, Europeans now are taking a really strong stance and shifting how they might contribute to more stability and security for Ukraine. So he's not afraid to sort of take a threat in one area, I think tariffs is a good example, and have it have a ripple effect in another area. And Nixon, wanted that too. And all the times he negotiated with the Soviets on arms control agreements, he was not afraid to say, okay, I'm willing to scrap this deal or threaten the meeting or the summit if we don't see action in another area, especially Vietnam. Now, not everything worked out perfectly. He didn't get everything that he wanted, but he was able to sort of triangulate and work through the complexity of those relationships. And I think Trump loves that, actually. I think he thinks it's fun. I think there's a good chance he thinks that he can make various deals with China. I don't think he's an ideologue.
The flip side of all that you've just described there, which is, you say, the linkage and the things that he may have been able to achieve, whether it's, you say, some evidence that maybe with Panama, with Canada, these things are working. The flip side of all that, where you take this very aggressive line, especially with countries that are traditional allies, Canada, most obviously, Western Europe, most obviously the European members of NATO, where he's been extremely critical, and J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been extremely critical. And then you have this performance that we saw last week where he really lays into President Zelensky in the Oval Office. The flip side of all that is the soft power side, right? I'm of a certain age. I grew up in Britain in the Cold War. We grew up in the shadow of the Second World War, and during the Cold War, America was the good guy, right? I mean, in the end, Vietnam sometimes didn't look like America was the good guy during Vietnam, and there were always episodes like that. But there was this broad, certainly in the West, to some extent beyond the West, but certainly in Europe and in the Anglosphere, if you like, there was this sense that America was on the side of liberty and freedom and goodness and virtue and all of those kind of things. And again, not casting any kind of moral aspersions on the president here, but when you behave in the way that he has in these first 6 weeks, and certainly I've just been in Europe, and you see the reaction in Europe, and you see the reaction of our current allies, I actually, made the mistake there of saying former allies, and how horrified they've been by it. Is that just a collateral damage as Trump remakes the world or responds to this new world order that you've talked about? And we just have to sort of say, oh, sorry, swallow it, and that's hard? Or is he risking real damage here to America's interests by sort of transforming this country from, broadly speaking, what's seen as a kind of a benign ally to a potentially increasingly kind of malevolent adversary?
Do you mean that America becomes malevolent?
Yeah. You see some of the reaction in Europe right now. And by the way, the Europeans are hysterical, but whatever. But that's certainly how a lot of people in Europe are talking about right now.
I think relationships move in waves. I think now we are seeing a lot of frustration, from the Europeans. But on the other hand, Trump is focused on outcomes. He really, really wants to see better outcomes for the United States. And he wants to see, in terms of Ukraine, an outcome, which is an end to the war. Obviously, the terms do matter. Of course, they do matter. I think these relationships will be repaired. I think there are going to be some new European leaders to work with. I think we need to shift the focus to looking at opportunities to work together. But the Europeans have been, I think, from Trump's first term, there was not a lot of love in Europe for Trump, right? So I think it's been a contentious relationship for many, many years. I think we can get through this. I think the transatlantic alliance can weather this. I do. I think we need to think positively and look at the opportunities we have to work together. I mean, the Macron visit went well. The Starmer visit went well. We'll see how the new relationship with Germany starts to evolve. So I'm going to look optimistically at the opportunities that we have. I do think the transatlantic relationship is an important one for the reasons, actually, the Vance speech, there were many critics of it, but fundamentally he was reiterating the importance of a shared Western civilization with Europe too, and wanted the Europeans to actually appreciate that and stand up for it. And I think we can work on that core interest together.
We've had 6 weeks of Trump, and you've seen the people he's got in place. You've seen the things that he's done, and it has been an extraordinarily active time, both at home and abroad. But obviously, we're talking about the foreign policy side. What's your early assessment? Do you think he's broadly on the right track in terms of achieving what he wants to achieve, what needs to be achieved in this rapidly changing world order we're talking about? Just give us an overall assessment of these first 6 weeks of the administration.
Yeah, I think he has begun a reordering, relooking at international institutions that do and don't work for the United States. But I think a key part of this to bring back Nixon was that he saw our allies and partners as partnering in that reconstruction, in that rebuilding, and in the reordering. He saw our allies as taking a part in that. And I think that in terms of working together, our allies and partners need to come to the table and give us a sense of how they see that reordering too. So that's where I think we're seeing some of the dissension, that there always seems to be a pushback on virtually all of the elements of the reordering, not by everyone, of course, and I'm just generalizing, but a sense that we're not in this together, right? There's a sense that we're not all working toward this together. I mean, the Paris Climate Agreement has not been successful in its outcomes, right? It's objectively a fact. So why this religious adherence to it, right? The WHO has consistently failed over the years. And if you go back and look at some of the early SARS outbreaks and see the failures, an alarming parallel to what happened with COVID. So what about coming to the table and figuring out what we can roll up our sleeves on together and work together on? And I think that there is an opportunity to do that. But the emotionalism, probably we have to step back from the emotionalism right now that is really coloring a whole range of our relationships.
That's a very, very good note on which to end. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the hardest thing in life generally, but in diplomacy and grand strategy and everything else, is to recognize when, circumstances have changed as dramatically as they have. And I think you're absolutely right about the Europeans. I think there is just this continuing, maybe they're finally waking up, and we're seeing now, we'll see what happens. And maybe the Trump shock treatment is exactly what they need. But I think you're right that they continue to be wedded to a system which, again, as you say, at worst has failed completely, but at best is totally out of date for the circumstances we find ourselves in. Nadia Schadlow, former Deputy National Security Advisor and now at the Hudson Institute. Thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thank you so much, Gerry. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's it for Free Expression this week. Thanks very much for joining us. I'll be back again next week in these turbulent and rapidly moving times with another discussion on one of the big issues that's shaping the world. Once again, thanks for joining us. In the meantime, have a great week, and we'll speak to you next week.